Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. Good morning, yes, and once again, our learning today should be Le'iloi Nishmat HaChayal Ma'oz Ben Eitan Vivarda Morel, who unfortunately was injured a number of weeks ago from fighting in Gaza and passed away this morning or last night. His funeral is actually, I think, very soon. Yes, I think at 12 o'clock at Har Herzl for those who would like to join after. A couple of other technical announcements. You may, for those of you who were here a couple of weeks ago, may be wondering why I'm still here and why my father has not yet returned. So I apologize on my father's behalf that he had to stay in America for an extra few weeks for some medical testing. So he should hopefully be back. Don't know exactly when. Next week there's no class anyway, as we mentioned. So either in 2 weeks we'll probably either he'll be here back in 2 weeks, or I'll be here probably for my last time before my father returns. He apologizes, and I apologize that last week I wasn't able to cover, but I understand that Rabbi Shor was here, and I'm sure he was able to very ably fill this lot. So. Looking forward to having the opportunity to learn with you again today. And most importantly, the main reason why I had to come back, for those of you who were here 2 weeks ago, when we covered a very, very important topic regarding oral tradition and rabbinic law, I opened up last week with a story, 2 weeks ago with a story, and I forgot to share with you the end of the story. So I'm sure you've all been sitting there losing sleep, wondering when I was going to come back to share with you the end of the story. So I'll just very briefly share the beginning of the story and then share the end of the story as a nice way to summarize a little bit of what we saw 2 weeks ago when we discussed the history of the oral law and rabbinic tradition. The story that I opened up with was a story that actually happened to my father. My father was the rabbi, before he was the rabbi in Englewood, New Jersey, he was the rabbi in Potomac, Maryland. And one of the things he was able to accomplish in Potomac was to build an Eruv. And as part of his job was to make sure the Eruv was set, to check the Eruv on a consistent basis, and make sure that the Eruv was up so that the people of the community could carry on Shabbos. And there was one point where he had an assistant from the community who was helping him, and the way that the Eruv needed to be done, without getting into all the technical details, was that they had to line up a wooden pole, what's called a lechi, together with a string that was above it, in order to create what's called a tzurat hapetach, which is part of what's needed for the Eruv. And it was a particularly challenging angle, and it took them some time to really line up this piece of wood, line up this lechi with the string that was above. And after about 40 minutes of just this one back and forth and trying to figure it out, the congregant turns to my father and says, "Rabbi, I don't want to bother you while you're in the middle of this, but I have a question. Does God really care? Does God really care whether or not this wood, this lechi, is 1 inch over, right under the string, right above the string, right near the... Does it really matter?" And I opened up with that story because, as those of you who were here a couple of weeks ago may remember, we discussed the concept of oral tradition, the concept of the oral law, the history of the oral law, rabbinic tradition, and the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this incredibly complex but everlasting and eternal system that is rooted at Har Sinai and yet continues to apply for generations and generations. Without getting into too much, I opened up with that, and I told you I was going to share with you my father's response at the end of the class. And my father's response, which I think was very, very, I think one of those moments where he had a certain burst of inspiration. My father responded with the following comment. He looked at the congregant and he said, "I'll tell you the truth. I really don't know. I don't know if God cares, but I believe that God cares that we care." And I think that in one line that really summarizes the whole concept of halacha and the development of halacha over the generations, which is that on some level, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave OUIsrael the written Torah and the oral law and handed it to the rabbis of each generation to be able to apply it in a meaningful way. And in the end of the day, whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to care, because that is how we show our dedication to Him. That is how we become a part of the Jewish people, by being a part of the Masorah and by being part of everything that as we mentioned, is eternal and is rooted at Har Sinai, yet continues to apply to all of the generations. And so as I mentioned, I know many of you were probably having trouble sleeping the past 2 weeks because you were wondering what that response from my father was to the congregants. So now you can sleep well tonight. And with that, we're going to move on to this week's Parsha. So this week's Parsha is Parshat Tetzaveh, and I wanted to cover or discuss a topic that one of the Mefarshim, the Baal HaTurim, points out. It is something that many of us are familiar with, and is a little bit of a phenomenon, and that is what I call here at the beginning at the title Moshe's absence. Interestingly enough, since the birth of Moshe in Parshat Shemot, Moshe's name appears in every single Parsha in the Torah, until the end of the Torah, from Shemot all the way until the end of the Torah, with the exception of one Parsha. This week's Parsha, Parshat Tetzaveh. And a number of Mefarshim try to understand why that is. Why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu, who is the central figure of the Jewish people, obviously from the time that he was born, all the way through the end of the Torah, he's the author of the Torah, author together with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu of the Torah. So why is it that all of a sudden Moshe's name is not mentioned? To take this even a step further, as we're going to see a little bit later, when we really delve into some of the psukim in the Torah, much of this week's Parsha does actually involve Moshe. Moshe is involved in many steps in the process. Much of the initiation of Aaron HaKohen into becoming a Kohen is done through Moshe. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu talks to Moshe consistently throughout this week's Parsha. Ve'ata Tetzaveh el b'nei Yisrael, and you should speak or you should command to b'nei Yisrael. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu talks to Moshe, and yet Moshe's name is not mentioned. What is typically done when HaKadosh Baruch Hu talks to Moshe is that usually the Parsha will begin with Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor. And that's missing in this week's Parsha. Why is the opening different? We have a Parsha where Moshe is actually intimately involved in much of what happens, and yet for whatever reason, for some reason, his name is entirely absent. And the question is why? So I'd like to start, to understand this, to explore this, start with the commentary of the Baal HaTurim. The Baal HaTurim is a commentary on the Torah itself, written by the author of the Torah, who is an early or late Rishon, early Achron. And he makes this comment, and he brings two suggestions that I'd like us to kind of explore in detail. We'll start with source number one. We'll read it inside. I'll translate for you. Says the Baal HaTurim in source number one, Lo hizkir Moshe b'zeh haseder. Moshe's name is not mentioned at all in this week's Parsha. Ma she'en kein b'chol hachumash, which is something that is an anomaly from the rest of the Torah. Misha'a shenolad Moshe ein seder shelo huzkarba. From the time Moshe is born, there is no Parsha where he is not mentioned. What's the reason? So the Torah mentions two reasons briefly, and I'd like us to explore them a little bit more. V'hatam, what's the reason? Mishum she'amar mecheni na misifracha asher kasafta. There was a moment where Moshe says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, erase me from the Torah. V'kililas chacham afilu al tenai ba'a v'nitkayem bazeh. And when a Talmid Chacham gives a curse or declares something, even if in the end it's not going to come true entirely, a piece of it has to come true. So that's answer number one. Again, we're going to explore this more, but that's just answer number one. Answer number two, says the Tur, Baal HaTurim, Ve'od dezu haparsha midaberet petachsisei kuhuna. This parsha has focused on the initiation and the decoration and the clothing of the kuhuna. Umimoshe hayta hakuhuna hagdola latzet. Ela al yedei shesirev lalech bishlichut hamakom natla mimenu v'natna la'arod. Moshe, says the Baal HaTurim, was initially meant to be the Kohen, and this is a parsha all about the Kuhuna. And Moshe was supposed to be the Kohen in addition to the leader, and he lost it. And therefore, because he lost it, therefore his name is not mentioned in this week's parsha. Okay, so the Torah is giving us two drastically different reasons, both very, very important. And what I'd like to do first, before we explore more, is really understand these two reasons and get some much needed background to understand them. Yes?
He lost it because of what?
Sorry?
He lost it because of...
Oh, why did he lose it? Sorry, I didn't explain that. He lost it when he refused, when he argued with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he refused to go down to Mitzrayim, to be there, when he continuously argued with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We'll see it in more detail. So let's go back to answer number one. And in order to answer number one, we have to get some background. Look at source number two. Source number two is in Parshat Kitisa, after Chet HaEgel, after the sin of the golden calf. And Moshe goes back up to Har Sinai and tries to achieve kapara, atonement for Am Yisrael. Vayomer Moshe el Hashem. And Moshe says to Hashem, Vayomer ana chata ha'am hazeh chata'a gidola. He says to Hashem, please, I know the nation has sinned horribly. Vayasu lahem Elohei zahav. and he has done, and they did for themselves a golden calf, a golden god. They sinned. Ve'ata, however, now, im tisa chatatam, if you're willing to bear their sin, i.e. forgive them, then great. Ve'im ayin, and if you won't, mecheni na misifrecha asher katafta. I want you to erase me from the book that you have written. Okay, so Moshe is playing almost hardball with God. He's turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and he's saying, look, I agree they did something wrong. I wish they hadn't, but they did. However, please forgive them. And if you don't, then I want out also. Then erase me from everything. What does the HaKadosh Baruch Hu say? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Hashem says to Moshe, Mi asher chata li emchenu misifri. Hashem says to Moshe, no, it doesn't work that way. Whoever sinned, they're the ones who I'm going to erase. I'm not going to erase you. You didn't sin. The ones who sinned, they're going to be erased. Okay, now the first question we have to ask when we see this is, what sefer are they referring to? What book is Moshe referring to, and what book is God referring to? What, meaning there was no book that we know of. Okay, so there actually is a debate in Chazal. If you look at source number, before that, I didn't bring this source, but the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah actually suggests that the sefer that's referring to is not what we typically think, which is the sefer of the Torah. It's actually referring to the Sifrei Chayim v'Mesim that are open on Rosh Hashanah. That it's referring to the books. We know that around Rosh Hashanah time, during Yomim Noraim, the books of life and the books of death are open to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what Moshe was basically saying to Hashem was, if you're going to forgive them, great. And if not, I want you to kill me. I want you to erase me from the book of life. And you might as well just kill me because I am their leader, and if they're not going to get forgiven, it's just not worth it for me. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds and says, no, that's not how it works. Those who sin, they get punished, and those who don't sin don't get punished. So that's one interpretation. The other interpretation, the more standard interpretation, that Rabbeinu Bechaya brings over here in source number 3, Micheni na misifrecha, excuse me, al das hapshat hu sefer haTorah. It refers to the Torah. Refers to the Torah itself. V'ratzah lomar. So what is Moshe basically saying? Shelo yeh niskar b'Torah v'shelo tinatein al yado. Moshe is basically saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you're going to forgive them, great. But if you're not going to forgive them, I want no part of this whole Torah thing. I don't want my name mentioned in the Torah. I don't want to give the Torah to the Jewish people. I don't want it. Either you forgive them, or that's it. Excuse me. And obviously, as we know, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that's not how it works. I'm not going to take you out of the Torah. Those who sinned need to get punished, and those who don't need to get punished. However, says Rabbeinu Bechaya, ve'al da'at hamedrash misifrecha kilalat chacham afilu al tanai hiba'a. How do we know this concept that any time a chacham says a curse or says something on condition or suggests something, it has to come true? Minalan mi Moshe. She'amar mecheni, v'af al pi shenitkaper lahem avon ha'egel nimches shemo mi Parshat v'ata Tetzaveh. That even though when Moshe said it was, if you don't forgive them, I want you to remove me from the Torah, and ultimately HaKadosh Baruch Hu does forgive them. Nevertheless, because he made that t'nai, on some level it needed to come true, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, instead of removing Moshe's name from the entire Torah, removed it from one parsha, and took it out of Parshat Tetzaveh. Okay, so according to this understanding, Moshe approached God and said, please forgive them. If you don't, erase me from the Torah. In the end, HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgives them. But because Moshe had declared this condition of being erased from the Torah, it had to come true on some level, and therefore he is erased from Parshat Tetzaveh. Any questions about that? Yes.
So, in between each sefer, in other words, there are spaces.
Correct, and between Parshiot as well, except for Parshat Vayechi. Meaning, yes, between Parshiot there are spaces as well. Not always as much space, but there are spaces between Parshiot as well. Parshat Vayechi is an exception, and there's a whole discussion why. I think what you're asking is how much of this is based on Misorah.
Right.
So if I understood correctly, the Parshiot are part of our oral tradition. The Prakim that we know, where it's Perek Aleph, Perek Bet, I think that comes from something outside of Jewish tradition.
Okay, that's right.
If I remember correctly.
Yeah. That's right.
But the Parshiot themselves is a tradition.
Because I was just thinking maybe the Parshiot were constructed such that this Parsha itself artificially.
Also a quick question. Yes, so I think the parshiot themselves is part of the tradition, but it's more the prakim that are not. But what other question could we be asking about this?
Rabbi?
Yes.
I mean, I'm not sure this is part of the curriculum today, but although Moshe made the petition, God didn't allow he entered to the promised land, Israel.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, sorry, but I have to say this part. I forgot the age limit, 20 or 21. All of them who saw the miracle, but leg of faith, God allowed them die in the midbar. Only younger generation who never see the miracle in the midbar allowed to enter, conquer the land, and were their descendants. So how dealing with the sin part?
Well, you are correct that that's not really connected. I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's a very good question as to how that developed and the whole decision of Moshe not entering and the second generation entering. It's a very, very good question, and I think it's really just a little bit different. So I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's a very good question. But there's something specific about this. Yes.
The word "you."
Okay.
Still calling somebody something.
Good. You're saying you should be, even though Moshe's name isn't mentioning you. Good point. But I want to say yes.
When was the Torah written? How could it, I mean, Moshe says, take my name out, but wasn't the Torah written?
So that's a good question. Now, there's different, now, again, this is a very, very good question, and we all know that there's a famous Zohar that says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked into the Torah and created the world. And I don't know exactly what that means and how much that's meant to be taken literally, but there are, and the Mefarshim, by the way, debate when different parts of the Torah were written. Some Mefarshim suggest that at Har Sinai was given up until the time, everything up until what happened, up until the Torah, and the rest of it was written at the end of the Torah, at the end, meaning at the end of the Zos HaBracha. So it's all a very good question. And I think you're raising a very good point. But another way of saying this is, why Parshat Tetzaveh? Okay, let's assume that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides, you know what? I need to take Moshe's name out of something. But why Tetzaveh? If it's all based on seemingly this idea that Moshe said, I want to come out of I erase my name. Why Parshat Tetzaveh? Not only that, it sounds almost funny, but Parshat Tetzaveh, according to certain understandings, happened before Chei Regel. It happened, right? Parshat Tetzaveh comes before Parshat Kitisa. So some Mefarshim will actually suggest, well, no, that's the point. It was the last Parsha that had been written right before this whole event happened. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu went and erased Moshe's name out of it. Okay, but the real question is it just random? Was it just, it happened to be the last Parsha? Or is there something more significant going on here? And I think for that, we need to connect to the second suggestion that the Baal HaTorah made. The second suggestion connects this idea not just to an event where Moshe says, erase me, but connects it to the content of Parshat Tetzaveh. And what is the content of Parshat Tetzaveh? And that is the inauguration and the initiation of the Kohen. So let's look at source number 4. This is a Gemara in Zvachim where the Gemara has actually 3 opinions regarding Moshe's status in relation to the Kahuna, in relation to being the Kohen. The Gemara in source number 4 says the following: Vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe. Hashem gets inside the Moshe. This is just to set the stage. Hashem gets inside the Moshe. This is referring to the conversation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has with Moshe at the burning bush. God talks to Moshe at the burning bush and says, Moshe, it's time for you to go down to Mitzrayim to take my people out. And Moshe says, who am I? I'm not the right person. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, don't worry, I'll be with you. Aaron will be with you. I'll help you. Moshe says, I can't do it. I can't talk. Hashem says, don't worry. Who do you think gave speech? I'll take care of you. And then Moshe finally says, Shlach na biyad tishlach. Basically says, just not me. Says the Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu then got upset at Moshe. So says the Gemara, Vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe. Hashem gets upset at Moshe. Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha Omer, Kol Charon Af Shebatorah Ne'emar Bo Roshem V'zeh Lo Ne'emar Bo Roshem. Every time that the Torah talks about HaKadosh Baruch Hu getting upset, there usually is some kind of practical result from that anger. And yet, says Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, here there was nothing meaning Moshe never got punished for this. Nothing ever happened to Moshe as a result of this anger. That's one opinion. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai argues. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, no, Av Zeneh Bar Bo Roshem. There was a lasting effect of Hashem's anger, even here. Why? Shene Emar, because the pasuk says, Behalo Aharon Achicha Halevi. The pasuk says, Aaron, your brother, the Levi, is coming towards you. V'halo Kohen. Why does the Torah call him a Levi? Aaron is not just a Levi. He's actually going to be a Kohen. Hachi Ka'amar. Says the Gemara, this is what it means to say. Ani amarti ata kohen v'hu Levi. Achshav hu kohen v'ata Levi. Initially, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's teaching Moshe a lesson. He's saying, Moshe, initially, you were going to be the Kohen, and Aaron was just going to be a Levi. And now, as a result of this, of your refusal to go, and you're arguing with me, he's going to be the Kohen, and you're going to be the Levi. So according to this tradition, Moshe lost the kahuna. According to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, according to Rashbi, Moshe was meant to be the Kohen, and he loses the opportunity to be the Kohen at the burning bush. The Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim argue. The Chachamim say, Lo nitkahen Moshe ela shiv'at yemei hamiluim bilvad. The Chachamim argue and they say, no. The truth was Moshe was never meant to be the Kohen. Moshe only was meant to serve as the Kohen during the inauguration of Aharon's kahuna. When Aharon becomes inaugurated as the Kohen, there needs to be somebody who's going to inaugurate him, to act in place of the Kohen in order to initiate him and do everything that needs to get done. And that was Moshe. So Moshe was always only intended to be a Kohen for 7 days to initiate Aharon, which actually takes place in Parshat Tetzaveh. We'll get to that soon. And that was all that was meant to be. That's opinion number 2. V'yesh omrim, the third opinion, lo paska kahuna ela mizaro shel Moshe. The third opinion says not only was Moshe meant to be the Kohen, he remains the Kohen. Moshe and Aharon were actually both Kohanim throughout their lives. The only difference between Moshe and Aharon was that Aharon passed that kahuna on to his children, and Moshe did not. Okay? Lo paska kahuna ela mizaro shel Moshe. The only thing that happened was Moshe remained a Kohen, and he and Aaron were the Kohen together, but Aaron passed that down to his children and his progeny for generations, whereas Moshe was a Kohen just for that generation. Okay, so what actually comes out is, and it's fascinating, is a whole range of opinions regarding Moshe's relationship with the kahuna. One opinion says Moshe was never meant to be the Kohen. It was never part of the plan. He only needed to do it technically in order to initiate Aharon. That was the Chachamim. The second opinion says not only was he meant to be the Kohen, but he actually was the Kohen. And was a Kohen throughout his life. He just didn't pass it on. And the third opinion, which is the first one quoted in the Gemara, is an in-between. He was meant to be the Kohen, and he lost it. And says the Baal HaTurim, based on what we had seen before, that was the reason why Moshe's name is left out of Parshat Tetzaveh. Because since the Kahuna, which is the subject of this week's Parsha, was what Moshe had, at least according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and lost, in order to signify or to symbolize that Moshe lost that opportunity, his name was taken out of Parshat Tetzaveh. Okay, so just to summarize what we've seen so far, the question we asked was, why is it that Moshe's name is not found in Parshat Tetzaveh? 2 reasons were mentioned by the Baal HaTurim, and we kind of gave some background to understand them. Answer number 1 was because Moshe, forgive me, I'm blanking. Oh, right. Because Moshe requested to have his name erased from the Torah, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu therefore took it out of one parsha. And in that question, we said, okay, but why this parsha? And I think if we combine it with the second answer, it makes more sense because this was the one thing that Moshe had and actually lost. Because of that, Moshe was commanded to. Therefore, his name was taken out, and therefore his name is not mentioned in this week's parsha.
And it would be an embarrassment to him.
What do you mean?
Because we're talking about the kahuna, and to have Moshe's name included in this parsha.
So you're saying that he was actually done at right. One way to look at it was almost to highlight the punishment, and what you're suggesting is actually was done out of kavod to Moshe, which is interesting. To highlight the fact that this was something that would just have him be in the background, kind of. Exactly. Very nice. Yefeh. I'd like to share with you a third opinion, a third approach, which is my father's approach. It can be found in his book, Unlocking the Torah Text, which I think adds another layer to this whole picture. Look at source number 5. As intriguing as the midrashic explanations for Moshe's absence in Parshat Tetzaveh may be, a much simpler yet equally powerful pshat explanation can be offered. Parshat Tetzaveh is Aaron's parsha, the section of biblical text which introduces the glorious role that Aaron and his descendants will assume across the ages. In recognition of the fact that, that this is his brother's moment, Moshe is forced to take a step back out of the limelight. Moshe is certainly present playing an essential role in the proceedings. Aaron, however, is center stage. Even Moshe, the greatest leader our people has known, must at times step aside to allow others to shine. Okay. So I think a very, very simple, but yet very important suggestion that my father makes, which is that our Moshe specifically almost takes himself, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes him out, in order to let Aaron shine, in order to enable Aaron. This is Aaron's Parsha. This is what he is, and a leader needs to be able to know when he should be in the limelight and when he needs to step back. And this is obviously a very, very practically and a very, very relevant thing for all of us. And I'm not talking about any specific leader in general, chas v'sholom, not at all, and I mean that seriously. But unfortunately, in today's world, we deal with many leaders who all they care about is the limelight. I remember listening to a political commentator who pointed out that it used to be a person went into government. America, Israel, wherever it is, you go into government to serve the people. Now people go into government in order to get a stage, and then ultimately to use that stage for something else. Unfortunately, that's not what politics has become, and I think it's across the board. But a real leader is somebody who knows when he's supposed to take center stage, and when he needs to step back and allow somebody else to shine. And I'd like to take this a step further, because I think my father's suggestion is important, but I think we need to take it. Yeah, is there a question there? I want to take it a step further, but yes, please.
Just listening to these four different topics, good one.
Excellent. I think you're 100% right. I think what you're pointing at is a methodological point that is true in all learning of Torah. And we saw it even a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about, learning halacha and elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. And we talked about how could both, if one opinion says mutter and one opinion says asur, how could they both be the will of God? And the answer is it's not as much about the conclusion as much as it is about the process and about loyalty to the process. I think you're 100% correct. Whenever you're dealing with midrashim, okay, we quoted midrashim in Gemarot. Whenever you're dealing with medrash or agadata, this is something my father is fond of talking about. Some people some people do, and we happen to think that's mistaken. I've learned that from my father and from many of my teachers, which is that medrash, especially agadic stories, are not necessarily meant to be taken literally. Rather, they are there to convey a message. And therefore, when we're talking about two different midrashim that give two different answers, so then which one is it? The answer is we may never know, because we don't know why HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose to leave Moshe's name out. The question is, what are the messages that we can gain from him? And I think you're correct. And that's also based on the concept of shivim panim la Torah, which is that there are different messages and different ways things that we could learn. Some midrashim did happen. We don't necessarily know. So, for example, a classic one my father used to talk about, used to bring it as an example, was the one about the sun and the moon. And we know that the sun and the moon were the same size, and then because the pasuk says that there were two orot, and then one became small, one became big, and many of us are familiar with the medrash that says because the moon complained and said you can't have two kings, and therefore the moon meant small. Now, could it be that happened? It could be that happened, or it could be it's meant to convey a message and a lesson that we're supposed to take. So midrashim at their core are meant to convey important messages that Chazal wanted to relay, and they use the stories from the Torah to shape that message. 100%, yes.
Oral law has anything to do with Agadata and Midrash?
So, great question. Oral law does include Medrash and Agadata. For example, the Gemara itself is oral law, is the main canon of oral law, and it includes halacha and it includes agadata. Yet, when we learn halacha is halacha. When we learn agadata, we always have to recognize that agadata is open to interpretation, because agadata is not necessarily meant to always be taken literally. There are so many stories in the Torah that many of us grow up assuming that they were in the Torah. And then we grow up and we realize, hey, you know what? That's not actually Torah. Okay, what's another classic example? How many of us have heard the story, or the story of Avram and the idols? Breaking the idols. Not in the Torah. Or Avram and the burning and being thrown into the furnace. Now, does that mean it never happened? We don't know. It may have happened, it may not have happened. Or it may just simply, or Avram discovering God. The Torah is very, very deliberately vague on how Avram discovered HaKadosh Baruch Hu and discovered in that whole process. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but we don't know whether it happened or whether it's just simply meant to teach us a lesson. And that is, again, this isn't a class on I'm no expert on Midrash. But you are correct in that the beauty of Midrash is that it gives different interpretations. And sometimes the message isn't always which actually happened. We may never know. But simply, what are the messages that we can learn from the different interpretations? Rashi and the Ramban, the Sforno, and they're constantly arguing about many different aspects of the Torah, and we may never know which one is true. But the messages and the lessons that we can learn are certainly extremely, extremely valuable. Okay, so what I'd like to suggest is that I think we need to take my father's idea a step further. My father suggested that Moshe was enabling Aaron to take the spotlight. But I think it's even greater than that. Because if we take a look and we explore the beginning of this week's Parsha, we see that Moshe is actually incredibly active. Not only is he incredibly active, but I would argue to suggest that Parshat Tetzaveh is probably the one Parsha where Moshe is the most active, maybe even in the Torah. And let's follow along. I brought you just a few, as an example, I brought you about 20 psukim for us to read through together. And I want to highlight to see how ironic it is that Moshe's name is not mentioned in this Parsha, but yet his presence is very much there. Look at the beginning of the Parsha. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the beginning of this week's Parsha, source number 6. Source number 6. It should be the last source, I believe. V'ata Tetzaveh el b'nei Yisrael. And you should command to Bnei Yisrael, v'yichu elecha shemen zayit zach, katit la ma'or la halot ner tamid. You should command to Am Yisrael to bring you the oil and everything in order to light the menorah. Be'ohel moed b'chutz la parochet, asher la'idut yaruch oto Aaron uvanav. You should make sure that in the oil moed, Aaron is going to prepare the menorah and light it. So who's Hashem commanding? Who's Ve'ata? Moshe Rabbeinu. Kadosh Baruch Hu is saying to Moshe, you got to make sure that this happens. Right after that, meaning the next few psukim, Perek Chavchet, Ve'ata hakrei ve'lechet Aaron achicha, you should bring Aaron to you. Vet banav yitom mitoch b'nei Yisrael lechano li, you should bring Aaron and his sons. Pasuk bet, Ve'asita bigdei kodesh la'Aaron achicha, lechavod u'letifaret, and you should make the bigadim of the kuna. Now, did Moshe actually make them? No. Look at the next pasuk. Ve'ata tedaber al kol chachmei liv, asher mileitiv ruach chachma ve'asu et bigdei Aaron lekadesho. You should speak to those people who are talented enough and know how to make the bigdei kuna, and they should make the bigdei kuna. So Moshe is in charge of making sure that the menorah is lit. Moshe is in charge of making sure that the bigadim of the kuna are all being built, are being made. Excuse me. And then I skipped a little bit just for clarity's sake, we have the end, a majority, after the Torah describes each of the Bigdei Kuna in detail, the Torah then describes the initiation of Aharon and his sons into the Kahuna. And who is the one who runs this initiation? Moshe. He's extremely active. So again, I'll read through it and I'll translate just to understand it. Perek Chavtet. We skipped a couple of psukim. V'zeh hadavar asher taseh lekadesh otam lechahen li. And this is what you should do for them in order to initiate them, in order to sanctify them. Lekach par echad. You should take a cow ben bakar ve'elim shnayim tmimim ve'lechem atzod. And you should take all of these different things. Pasuk Gimel, v'natata otam al salechad. You should then put all these breads into a basket. V'hikravta otam basal, and you should bring them into the basket. V'etapar v'et shnei ha'ilim. V'et Aaron v'et banav takriv el petach olam moed. You should bring Aaron and his sons to the olam moed. V'rachotzta tamamayim, and you should wash them with water. V'lakachta tabigadim. You should take all the bigadim. V'ilbasht et Aaron. You should get Aaron and his sons dressed. V'afadet alob, and you should put on the bigdei kahuna. Pasuk Vav, v'samtam mitznefet al rosho. You should continue to put the mitznefet on Aaron's head. V'natata et nezer hakodesh al mitznefet. You should put the tzitz on top of the mitznefet. V'lakachta et shemen hamishcha. And you should take the oil that's going to be anointing them. V'yatzachta al rosho u'mashachta oso. And you should take that oil and put it on Aaron HaKohen and on the bigadim in order to anoint him. V'et banav takriv v'ilbashtam kutanot. Then you should get Aaron's sons dressed. Again, putting on all of these different garments. Pasuk Yud, v'hikravta et apar, and you should bring the par that's going to be the korban. Lifnei ol hamoed, v'samach Aaron uvanav et yideihem. They're going to do the smicha, but you should bring it. V'shachat et apar, and you should shech the par. Pasuk Yud bet, v'lakachta midam apar v'natatal karnot hamizbeach. You should take from the blood and sprinkle it on the mizbeach with your finger. That kol adam tishpoch, and the rest of it you should spill on the bottom. V'lakachtat kol hachelev anechaset hakerev v'teyoteret ala kaved v'etshtei haklayud, and you should take all the different innards from this animal, and everything. And again, it goes on and on and on. Moshe is incredibly active in this week's parsha. What's Moshe basically functioning as? The Kohen. Moshe is functioning as the Kohen, whereas normally you have the Kohen and you have what's called the owner, the Baal of the animal, and the Kohen does much of the work, and the Baal does the smicha, and he's the one who really achieves the kapara. Here you have Aaron as the owner, as the Baal, and Moshe's functioning as the Kohen. So the irony here is that not only is this the parsha where Moshe's name is not mentioned, but it actually is the parsha where Moshe is in my opinion, probably the most active he is at any other part in the Torah. So what could be the message here? Why would you have a situation where Moshe is being left out, deliberately, I should say, being left out, but yet at the same time we see that he is functioning and doing everything that the Kohen needs to do? Yes?
If you want to make a Josh on it, you could say, that you should be involved in helping.
So I think it's a beautiful drash, and I want to take it a step further. I think it's basically what my father was suggesting, but taking it a step further. Moshe didn't just need to step back and let Aaron have the limelight. Moshe needed to support and enable Aharon to take that limelight. Meaning, Moshe's job wasn't to just be like, okay, well, I'm not involved in this. I'm just going to go back and do my thing, and you do what you need to do. Kadosh Baruch Hu was saying to Moshe, you know what a leader is? A leader is somebody who knows that when he needs to take a step back, he's not just going to say, well, I'm not doing it, so it's not me, I'm not going to. No, a leader is somebody who supports, cultivates, helps, creates the next generation of leaders. And so, Moshe, your name is not going to be mentioned because this is Aaron's time. But you need to be ever present in the background. You need to be the one doing all the shechting. You need to be the one doing all the stuff that needs to get done. Aaron's going to do the smicha. This is for Aaron. This is Aaron's day. This is his inauguration. He's going to, and you know what? Ironically, what's going to happen is Aaron's going to play this role for generations to come for all of OUisrael, because they're going to bring the korban and they're going to achieve the kapara, and Aaron's job is going to be to support them from the side, to do what needs to get done. And Moshe, this is your moment. Your moment is sometimes the leader needs to not just step back, but needs to support from behind. Sometimes leaders need to know when to lead from in front, and sometimes leaders need to know when to lead from behind. And Moshe's job at this point was to lead from behind, was to give Aaron that support, to be there to do all the little things. To be there, be active. He's the ve'ata, he's the guy in the background, running and doing and being there and doing everything, but letting Aaron be front and center. I just want to add one thing. I once heard a quote, and I don't know if I'm quoting it entirely correctly, but the idea is very much the same. I heard this from Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs, I read it from him. He said, good leaders create students, but great leaders create new leaders. And that's exactly what a leader is meant to do. A leader is somebody who doesn't just lead, but also makes sure to cultivate the next generation of leaders. As what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was teaching Moshe was, you're the leader, and there's going to be a leader here who's going to complement you. And we're going to see in a minute how complex this may have been for Moshe Rabbeinu. We'll get to that in a second. But your job, Moshe, is to help Aaron become center. Do all the things that need to get done, lead from behind, take care of all the details, but let Moshe have his moment. And that perhaps is let Aaron have his moment, thank you. That perhaps might be the message of this week's Parsha. Yes?
Well, in the past, Moshe was the pedagogue. He was Aaron, and to the future generations after him.
Yes, I believe that as well. I don't think it takes away.
That's a complete step back.
So it's a great. What you're raising is a great question, and it's a good point. And I don't think it necessarily goes against what we've been saying. How does Moshe? Meaning the way that Moshe did what he did was by showing. You're 100% right. It's almost as if
Because his name's not mentioned,
right.
It doesn't mean we don't know it was him, because you. Well,
correct,
it was the you.
correct. Moshe did do it, and another way of saying it might be, by the way, that the kahuna, according to the opinion that says that Moshe lost it, and he was only the Kohen for 7 days. Maybe the kahuna on some level, I'm going to say something that sounds a little bit like almost metaphysical. Maybe it passed through Moshe on the way to being Aaron. Moshe was the model for those 7 days. He was the guy, and then he gave that and gave it to Aaron, as it were. Which could be. It could be. Everything you're saying, and you're right. Meaning, who was the first person to show Aaron what needs to get done?
But as a
Moshe.
teacher,
But as a
and
teacher.
as the pedagogue, that was another one of his functions. It
Correct.
doesn't mean that his name had to be mentioned.
Correct. But I think the lesson is that sometimes people understand, I think you're 100% right, that this might have been his role. Now I understand what you're saying, I think better, which is that this was very much a part of his role as a teacher and a
Well, in order to teach your child how to do
modeling
something,
is the best way. Yafeh. Beautiful.
You have to model it,
Beautiful.
You have to show.
Beautiful. But the only challenge, and I think you're 100% right, but I think that sometimes people's vision of what a leader and a teacher is that they always need to be, they need to be, and I think the message here is something deeper. I think you're right. I think practically what Moshe was doing was, he was demonstrating what a teacher and a leader are. Exactly.
Sometimes you have to demonstrate in order to.
Exactly. And sometimes you can put in all the work, but not get the name, not get the name. And that's, I think, what's happening here. Anyone who's discerning and reads the Parsha knows how present Moshe was. But at the same time, it's also known as the one Parsha where Moshe's name isn't mentioned. So what that shows us is that Moshe was willing to put in the work. Moshe was willing to help, be active, supportive, whatever you want to call it. But he was willing to not have that name because that's what a leader needs to be sometimes. Sometimes the leader needs to be there. You need to be the face. You need to step up. You need to be the person to take either the credit or the hit, whatever it's going to be. That's part of being a leader. But there are moments when a leader needs to also know that in order to cultivate a next generation or a co-leader, which is really what Aaron was on some level, you need to be able to step back, help, support, push, be there, but not be the one whose name is mentioned in order to enable Aaron to take his credit. And just one other point that I want to add, which is that think about this, again, as we mentioned, there were different opinions as to whether or not Moshe lost the kuna, he wasn't supposed to have the kuna, but think about it from Moshe's perspective. Remember, these were human beings. Okay? As great as they were, and perhaps because of the fact that they're human beings, we were able to learn as much as we do from them. How complicated this might have been for Moshe on two levels. Number one, if he lost the kahuna, maybe on some level this was difficult for him as a reminder of something he could have had and lost. And now not only is he giving it to his brother Aaron, but he's going to be very, very involved in passing it along to Aaron. Now again, there's all indications are that Moshe did this with grace, just like Aaron allowed Moshe to be the leader in Mitzrayim with tremendous grace. There's no indication that there was a problem, but that doesn't take away from the potential complications that may have been going on. But one other piece which is very, very important. Moshe wasn't just involved in inaugurating Aaron. Who else was Moshe involved in inaugurating?
His children.
Aaron's sons. Now why might that be particularly difficult for Moshe? Because it's a reminder of the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu, and there's many midrashim that point to this, that Moshe Rabbeinu's own sons are not going to succeed him.
Right.
And what kind of things might have been going on in his head where here he is, he's inaugurating his brother for something that, at least according to some opinions, he was meant to have and he lost. Okay? Or, according to another opinion, he was going to maintain and have, but his children were not going to follow him in that path. And now he was about to inaugurate Aaron and his children for perpetuity, but yet his own children were not going to succeed him. Now, why do his own children not succeed him is a totally separate question and a big discussion. And in the end of the day, we don't really know why. It was just what HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided. HaKadosh Baruch Hu picked other people to succeed Moshe Rabbeinu. But imagine from a certain perspective how difficult that may have been for Moshe, and yet as we see, Moshe and Aaron somehow managed to break that mold of sibling rivalry that had been shaping generations of Jews all the way down to Mitzrayim, and that all of a sudden now, meaning starting from Yitzchak and Yishmael to Yaakov and Esav to Yaakov's 12 sons, all of a sudden we have Moshe and Aaron leading them out of Egypt with a certain incredible partnership, where Aaron's not jealous of Moshe, that Moshe is going to be the leader of the Jewish people initially, even though Aaron is the oldest. And yet Moshe is willing to step aside and do what needs to get done to help Aaron and his children become the Kohanim, even though that might be a painful thing for him given his own challenges with his children. So again, just food for thought. None of the things that I said is, as we say, mukhrach, but some things that maybe to think about. Yes, question or comment?
Just a comment. Moshe already had the model of Avraham Avinu, had the ultimate test of the Akedas Yitzchak. So I'm suggesting the idea that this was a painful moment was it a painful moment for Avram? We don't know, but obviously Moshe, who had the understanding of what the commands were from on high, knew very well that this is what it was supposed to be. So the parsha is all about modeling, and this to me is the big drasha of the parsha, that each generation has to model behavior
Sure.
for the next generation.
Absolutely.
And that's the big drudge. I mean, you really rounded everything out from the beginning of the end of your whole presentation, and it's the modeling aspect and how it is that we have to model to our children.
To our children, correct.
Our children, so that our children model
to their children. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's my
Absolutely. The only thing that I would say, and I think you're right about, now regarding Avram and the challenge that Avram had versus the challenge that Moshe had, it's an excellent question, and it's a big debate amongst the Mefarshim.
I'm sorry.
No, but I think, I don't take it as a question, but I think you're raising a very important point, which is, there are some who will choose to look at the Avos and will say that they were on a certain level, and therefore these things weren't as much of a challenge. There are Midrashim that do point and seem to indicate that Avram did struggle with Akedas Yitzchak. But that's the point. Because of that struggle, and yet he was still able to do it. Now again, each person can take, there's Midrashim Lakan Lakan, but the Medrash that describes, there's a famous Medrash that describes that Avram was going and there was a big river and he couldn't get past, that the Satan kept trying to do all these different things to stop Avram from getting to the mountain to in order to do Akedat Yitzchak. Now, it could be that was literal, but this could be a classic example of a Midrash that might be trying to give us a picture of what Avram had to overcome internally regarding this question. And therefore, the question of, did Avram struggle? It's a great question. Did Moshe struggle? I don't know. There's no indication that Moshe did. But I think it's worth raising that point, given the dynamics, to see whether or not he did. Now, in the end of the day, whether he struggled or he didn't, he obviously, passed with flying colors. But it's worth, I think, raising the question. Absolutely.
And his brother, who's the youngest, all the focus was on him.
Absolutely.
So
as the pasuk says, "V'ra'achav v'samach bilibo." Hashem says to Moshe at the burning bush, "You're going to meet your brother. He's going to see you, and he's going to be happy." Why does the Torah have to say that? So Rashi says, I think it's even the Medrash that says, in case you're nervous that he's not going to be happy, and you're 100% right. And that's the beauty of it, is that Moshe and Aaron each were able to do this. It was a mutually loving relationship, supportive relationship, where Aaron wasn't upset that Moshe was picked. And Moshe was also able to, as the leader, as the person who was involved in everything until now, to step aside and help Aaron achieve that as well when the time came for that to happen. And that there was a mutual admiration and respect that they had for each other. There's a question here, and then we have a couple more minutes. I'm happy to take the questions.
Hashem is our father. He's dealing with two children. He has to know to let each one develop.
Absolutely.
Because we never know as parents which of our two children in the same business, in the same role.
100%.
I don't know if you have any siblings. If
I do,
your father
thank God.
taught you both, whether one became a this and one became higher and lower. But and then I tell my children, when Yisrael went out, they went out in 12 different
12
roles,
tribes.
that each
Absolutely.
of our children is different, and we have to respect
Excellent.
that. And Moshe and Aaron were able to behave as siblings who loved one another, respecting that each one was different.
100%. But it's important to note that until Moshe and Aaron, we weren't able to do it. No, except for maybe Ephraim and Menashe might have been a model for that as well. But notice how in Jewish history, especially in Sefer Bereshit, as much as we knew it, it's still very hard to deal with it. Yes. Well, two questions and then we'll stop.
Demonstrates vatranut.
Yes.
That Moshe and Aaron, there was mevater to each other.
Exactly. Yafeh, thank you. Yes, final comment or question.
The fact that Moshe is listed publicly in the Torah, he's given the honor of being the one who could do it the best.
That this is maybe a symbol or one of those instances where he displays that anava in a very, very real way. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Reminder that next week there is no class on Tuesdays because of Election Day. So either myself or my father will be here in 2 weeks, Bezrat Hashem.